What are the prospects for young people in Britain today? To look into this, I'm joined by political commentator and man of Kent, Charlie Downs.
Hello, William.
Welcome.
Good to be here.
Good. Right, now, you've said that people feel failed, young people feel failed by the system, and that's on all the domains. So housing, expensive rents, poor jobs, an identity crisis and falling trust. So before we sort of get into it, how would you describe the general morale of young people in Britain today?
I think the outlook is pretty bleak. The perspective of most young people, because I think the thing that people misunderstand about a lot of young people is that the majority of those of us born after the millennium are not that political. I think there is a stereotype that goes around that all young people are super liberal and super politically engaged. And sure, there is a contingent who are that way, but it's still a minority. And the majority of young people, our desires are not particularly different to those of previous generations. I think, at a baseline level, perhaps we are more liberal than our, parents and grandparents. But really, in terms of priorities, it is, to own a house, to start a family, to work a job that is rewarding and for which you are fairly paid and then not excessively taxed, to have a state that you feel is in your corner and on your side, to have a culture that you can feel proud of and which you won't be made to feel ashamed of by the various kind of institutions in your country. And if you speak to most young people, they won't disagree with any of those kind of desires or expectations. But the fact is, ever since I've been alive, I was born in 2001, I've only ever known Britain as what it is today, a multicultural economic zone, somewhere where any sense of identity has been kind of crushed, essentially. The state has told us that to be British is to believe in very kind of abstract liberal values like democracy and tolerance. And that's not an identity.
No.
It's not a meaningful identity. And so therefore it's no surprise, which is to say nothing of the economic offerings, right? Housing today costs 10 times the average salary, where in 1997, before mass immigration began, it was 4 times the average salary.
Yeah.
You could have a single income home and own a house and raise a family on that income, and that's not an option today. It's actually essential to have 2 incomes. And so many young people, like myself, love this country. We grew up here. It's where all our friends are from. It's where our families are from. It's where we spent our childhoods. And we love, what this country is in its heart. But the way that it's being governed has left us feeling totally alienated and without any real desire, many of us, to stay.
Yeah, well, I'll get onto that. But I always think that I think it was a New Zealand politician said that what human beings need is somewhere to live, something to do, and someone to love. And the last one, I think, maybe politics can't sort that out for you. But the first two are just the basics that you're talking about. So, yeah, I agree with you. I think things are quite polarised. And one of the reasons people think that young people are quite liberal and, you might say woke, is that maybe those are the ones that make the noise. But most people are just trying to build their lives, so they're just trying to get on.
Yes.
And you're right, actually. You said in one of your I think it was an interview, that you can't imagine living anywhere else. No. But this is a theme I want to get into throughout the interview, because that's true, but you also think, well, why should I stay in a place where the state really doesn't look after me?
I think this is essential. So many young people, because they have no... they're not wedded to Britain. They might be British, they might be English, Scottish, Welsh or Irish, but they don't feel wedded to Britain because they don't feel that Britain is theirs. They don't feel that Britain belongs to them and that they in turn belong to Britain. And that is because of political decisions primarily, I think. And so it's no surprise that places that offer more prospects, economically, socially, whatever else, like Dubai, for example. Australia, yeah. are so much more appealing to young people. I think that's such a great monumental failing by our elites, to have stripped young people of identity, to have told young people that identity, belonging and meaning are to be found in things like the pursuit of a career or the pursuit of credentials at university or the kind of, immediate gratification of a hedonistic lifestyle where you're not restricted by things like family and national duty and these sorts of things.
That's true, but it's also a general atmosphere, isn't it? Because you're putting it at its most acute. If your generation has been brought up in shame, to be shamed, to think your culture is something to be ashamed of, and if your country's historical achievements are constantly denigrated, then again, it's discombobulating.
Yeah.
How can you buy into that?
But again, there is this contradiction because, like, I, for example, grew up in, I had the most English childhood you can imagine, right? I wrote about this in the Daily Mail not long ago on St. George's Day. I had the most sort of traditionally English upbringing you can imagine. And I don't think my parents even realized that that's what they were doing. They were just kind of
normal,
going through the motions. I think they were just replicating the childhoods that they had because they were beautiful. It was all just, it was kind of picnics at the beach and, holidays in Cornwall and, visiting National Trust and English heritage sites and all those sorts of things. The thing is that when I was growing up, I didn't really view them as being particularly noteworthy or unique. They were just what we were doing. I found it quite boring sometimes, actually.
It's ordinary. It has a sense. I mean, particularly the seaside stuff. And there's a film. I think it's Hancock and John Le Mesurier, the Punch and Judy Man, which is a 50s film. It's like a snapshot. It must be late 1950s and black and white. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's the ordinariness of the ice cream and the slot machines and the pier and all these, and incredibly British.
Yeah.
I mean,
but it's as I've entered my adulthood. And have noticed the fact that it's not just the state, it's every arm of the power structure that governs this country, from the corporations to the universities, the state itself, the civil service, NGOs, all of this entire entity that runs this country, seems to hate the conditions that made my childhood possible.
Yeah.
And I've watched as those things have disappeared. Right, English identity basically has disappeared. And so my.
Don't you think? Can I stop you there?
Yeah.
It has and it hasn't. So in the bit of the space that's controlled by liberal elites and progressives, and I would even call them progressive maniacs, some of them. That's true, and sort of orcophobia, self-hatred, other bizarre. Other concern and hostility to your own, that's all there. But there are pockets, right? There are pockets where it still exists and it happily, particularly in the hinterlands.
Yes,
right?
No, that's very true. And that's the thing for me, is my childhood and the things that I have loved doing throughout my life have taken on a political character because I have become aware, my consciousness has been raised, and I have become aware that those things are under attack, basically. Yeah. And this is I think it's the case with English identity specifically, because at the very least, the Scottish, Welsh and Irish will have their name spoken in the halls of power. But actually, you'll never hear our elites refer to the English unless it's during the World Cup.
We're allowed,
England for our elites is a football team.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated. So I'm an Anglo-Scot, but I live in England. I'm essentially English, but with Scots blood. But it's perfectly true what you say. I mean, there's no doubt at all that you can celebrate St Andrew's Day and Paddy's Day. And be proud to be Welsh. But the English, it's this sort of, it's a forbidden thing, isn't it? But then again, that's what the elite and the media, but it still exists. I mean, people are still very proud to be English.
Yes.
And Englishness is still, on the numbers, it's still very, very big, and it's there. But it's in pockets. I often think it's like a bird species that's, you've got, or like the red squirrel or something. You've got something change in the city that we're speaking from, London. It's not particularly English. I mean, the architecture is English architecture, and it has all the history and everything, but in character it's changed a lot. And John Cleese got himself into terrible trouble by saying it's not an English city, but he's just describing what's true. But I've been a couple of days here, and I work here a lot of the time, but I'll be getting the train to Newcastle tonight, and I'll be getting a little Trundley train up the Tyne Valley and going through Prudder and Riding Mill and over to Corbridge. And when I get home, and I look at the valley, and I look at the Roman site above me in St Andrew's Church, and then that is still absolutely. It'd be like people talk about France profonde. It's profound England. I think it's still there.
Yes, and this is crucial as well.
Where's your profounding? Where do you feel that?
Well, when I say my consciousness has been raised, what I mean by that is every minute of every day that I'm walking around England, I'm constantly looking around at the built environment and the natural environment and the people and all these sorts of things, and I'm noticing the fact that. I think for most people don't think about these sorts of things, right? Because it's just what it's always been. It's just there, right? But I mean, my fiance, for example, always tells me to stop going on about things when we're out and about, because I'll be pointing at that house and saying, look, there's a date on that house, 1852. Can you believe that? That house is nearly 200 years old. Yeah. That's amazing.
That's what I mean.
And the styles of the houses are distinct, and I'm getting increasingly good at sort of aging houses just by sight, which is a good skill.
Churches.
Yeah. And this is the thing. We're always going into Norman and Anglo-Saxon churches, because it's just amazing to go in there and feel the presence, not just of God, but also of the thousands of feet of your ancestors to whom you are connected that stood there before you and felt that same thing.
It's a real passion.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's sadly or not, I'm not a believer, but I do attend church. And actually, even if I don't attend services, I turn up regularly.
Yes.
And so there's a particular cycle which I do on Sundays to Warden through Hexham.
Just on this point, I do want to just continue on this for a moment. That is where my passion for England comes from. It's not from some rational place. I mean, I have rational arguments in favour of the existence of England and of the great achievements of the English people throughout history. But actually, it's an emotional or sentimental place that my true love of this country comes from. Because you can look out across the landscape of this country, as you were just saying, and you can see the hands, the many hands that have built this country.
Yeah.
You can look out across the landscape and see a Roman site. You can see, a Tudor house. You can see a castle. Yeah. You can see an Anglo-Saxon church. Yeah. All these different things, and it's as though the people of these isles have layered.
They're giving you
their character
across
the land.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting how, in the case of architecture, for example, you can walk around some parts of this country and you can see next to each other, you could see a Victorian, ornate, beautiful house next to a kind of a new build that's been built in the last 10 years. And the sort of revelation, what's revealed when you look at those things is what the people, is the character of the people that built them, I think. Because you can look at a Victorian house and you can see that what they were prioritising was not efficiency and cheapness, cost effectiveness, and all these sorts of things that builders think of now. It was beauty and stamping their character
permanence as well.
On the land. Permanence.
Yeah.
Whereas you look at these new builds, and this is what I would call the architecture of a godless people. This is architecture of a people who worships efficiency and innovation and all these sorts of things. And that's most keenly felt in the glass and steel skyscrapers of London, I think, because there was a time where the highest, tallest buildings in this city were churches, and now there are these great monuments, these great cathedrals to finance and capitalism.
Yeah, what happened was the modernist revolution was brutalism. I mean, if you get copies of the Architectural Review from the 50s and look at it, all of the architectural professionals, urban designers and planners thought this way, and anyone thinking of designing in the classical sense or designing with an eye to that had no chance at all. I mean, it was a total brutalist revolution. It washed over everything. Form follows function. Everything is stripped down. And of course, one of the reasons they did it was that it was cheap. It's just cheap. It's just cheaper to build like that. Everything is in rectangles and there's nothing on it. There's no embellishment. There's no beauty. There's no anything else. But it was irresistible if you think about it. And then the buildings they destroyed.
Well, I was walking around a town recently with a friend of mine. It was actually where I went to university. I was visiting him. And we were walking through a neighbourhood that was a former council estate. It's not anymore. It's now primarily student accommodation. And he said something to me really profound, which really stuck with me. And he's not he's not a political person, but he said he was just looking at the buildings and he said, you can tell these buildings were made without love. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Is you look at, for example, again, a Victorian house, and you can see that it was made with love. It was made with a care for the land that it was being built on and for the people who would see it. There was a consideration there that doesn't exist.
And very often vernacular as well. I mean, all over the country, you've got the older buildings are made with materials hewn from the very place.
Yes.
So parts of Northumberland with little sort of pock marks of iron. You go over to Cumbria and it's red sandstone. It's all vernacular. It's all rooted somewhere. Yeah. But there are contradictions here, and this is what I want to get into. So we're now in a situation we clearly love your country, but on the other, you said quite controversially. I mean, you said before that you would die for your country, and there's a patriotism in that. But you said that you wouldn't fight for modern Britain. Would you like to tell us a few?
Yeah,
and that was in a particular context, wasn't it?
So this was something I was really speaking about a couple of months ago. It was in the wake of this conversation about the potential for the British government to conscript people to go and fight in places like Ukraine.
Yes.
And it was that I said I would not be up for, and that if that was to happen, I would be a conscientious objector, and regardless of the consequences. And I don't say that lightly. I tried to join the army after I left university because at that time I felt a very strong sense of duty, and still do, to my country. And I felt that the best way for me to express that and for me to pursue that would be to join the army. And I was prepared at that time to put my politics to one side, as one would have to if they're in the army, because I, felt that it was my calling, ultimately. Now, I tried to join, but they wouldn't have me because I get migraines, which was very disappointing. And I think actually speaks to the very box-ticking nature of the recruitment process, because they're very infrequent, and the recruiter said that everything else was perfect on the application.
One of my best friends at school got through all the tests and the interview to go to Sandhurst, and they found out that in his medical records he had a fit when he had a growth spurt at 11 or 12. And take it.
Yeah, exactly.
He's never had a fit.
Exactly.
I mean,
So speaking as somebody who once did have ambitions to actually join the army, I'm now saying that to serve in the British Army, I believe, is no longer to serve Britain. It is to serve the interests of Britain's ruling class and also America's ruling class and the foreign policy establishment that exists in both of those countries, which, in my opinion, doesn't serve the interests of ordinary people. Because I don't think that we have any business, really, being involved in a conflict like Ukraine or Gaza. I think the amount of money that we have sent to both of those places, especially Ukraine, could have been far better spent here. And this notion that we need to maintain our standing on the world stage by funneling billions into the Ukraine conflict, I think is just farcical.
I think the problem with it is actually the recent wars, and the SCP has lots of military veterans in it. Is probably overweight military veterans, and I speak to them. There are a lot of people my age who look at Afghanistan, the 20 years of trying to turn Afghanistan into Holland or something crazy, and the chaos and the excess deaths in Iraq, largely military interventions that this country was drawn into by the United States. And I totally agree with you. And a lot of veterans have told me, and it's a very sad admission, that the friends they lost, they're not sure these things were very wise. And I agree. I mean, I agree with that. I think.
Well, what would one be dying for if they were sent off to Ukraine? You'd be dying for, quote, the liberal world order. But I don't really support the liberal world order. I think that the liberal world order that came into existence after the Second World War at that time made sense, the doctrine of human rights and all the rest of it, given the events of the middle of the century. But today, liberalism is what is tearing our societies apart, not just in Britain, but also in America and across the continent.
But there's also a pomposity in the ruling class, some of them, particularly sort of, strange enough, Tories, the military experts in the Tory party, have this view that we must be on the international stage. When are we going to sort out other people's problems? And during the election last year, the general advice on it's not that we have no view on the Arab-Israeli conflict in general, but when asked about it, I always said to candidates, well, the Arab-Israeli problem is not going to be sorted out in South Manchester. I'm really concerned with what's going on here, and it's the investment in our communities which counts.
And this is the point. The foreign policy establishment in Britain, from my perspective, it's akin to somebody who spends all of their money on designer clothes and then has no money left over for rent and for food.
It's not a reality-based thing. I mean, defence of these islands and protection of our people is the prime concern, and if they were competent at doing that, that would be basically sufficient.
And this is the point, just very quickly, I just want to make this point. If Britain was to be invaded, right, and obviously there's a conversation to be had about the small boats and all the rest of it, but if it was to be invaded, then I would fight and die for the country, because it's the country that I love. But being sent abroad to fight, the British state's wars for them,
or to try and preposterously turn all these countries into Western democracies, absurd.
That's absurd.
So British values you've talked about a lot, because your generation was brought up to imbibe the idea that British values were basically synonymous with progressive liberal values. That's what British values are, and that's what makes us British. Can you say a few words about your general reaction to that claim?
So I think this is so crucial, right, this point, because it's a phrase that everyone uses, British values. Everyone from Reform right the way through to Labour, and even the Greens, right? They all use the phrase British values. And it's because it's one of these phrases that you can kind of fill it with your own content, right? Because to one person, British values are, the stiff upper lip and the blitz spirit and all the rest of it. But to another, it's like gay marriage and diversity and all this sort of thing, right? And, they are actually codified in law. And this is the point. In 2015, the Conservative government codified them as democracy, the rule of law, tolerance of different faiths and belief, and mutual respect. right? And those, that's not, as I said before, that's not an identity.
No.
That's not what it means to be British.
But it's not a people either.
Yeah, it's not a people. And there's been plenty of people, British people, ethnically British people, throughout history, who have strongly disagreed with all of those things, right? And that doesn't make them not British.
Well, there are lots of minority groups that strongly disagree with them now.
Well, exactly, right?
Yeah.
Who the British state would tell us are British.
Yeah.
But this is the point, is this really came into the mainstream discourse in the late 90s with New Labour, right? This was a creation of Blair. And you'll hear him, especially in the early 2000s, using phrases like uniting around basic British values, as if that's always been the case. That's what this country has always been about. But actually, I think it's an Americanization of our country, where we are trying to turn our country into a propositional nation that's built on ideas, rather than what it actually is, which is a traditional nation built on history and people, most importantly. And the attempt to turn Britain into a propositional nation, I think, is what has led us to where we are now, in terms of mass immigration and all these other disastrous policies that are making life so difficult for ordinary people. Because, democracy, tolerance, and the rule of law do not a country make.
No, well, it's ahistorical, unempirical, because the first of the things that you mentioned, the British values, democracy in Britain's quite, I think we have quite, culturally, traditionally we have quite high embedded rights. I think there's a sense if you go into an English pub and order a pint of Adnams, you are free to speak your mind. And that's not true everywhere. I think that's an embedded right that we have. It's probably there. But this is not democracy. Democracy, working men and women were denied the vote until quite relatively recently. It's just within 100 years, less than 100 years. And then actually, I'd argue post-war entities like the European Union are pretty anti-democratic, and the same people are arguing for these democracy ideas, denying citizens the vote or a real say in some major things like trade policy, immigration. Really, the lot is taken off the table. So that's a load of nonsense. And the other thing that defeats the argument just flat is that the values are not stable.
No.
So the things that British people thought, the great liberalisation, if you look at you've no doubt looked at the British Social Attitudes Survey, the big one, and there's a great liberalisation from 50s, 60s onwards, and it's happened. But obviously, whatever British values were in the 50s, 40s are not what British values are now. And so, a great philosopher might say, they change like the fashion in hats.
Yes, that's very true. And the thing is, it's obvious that the British and the English, for example, have a character. There is a consistent character that runs through our people for the last 1,000 years.
But it's in the people.
Yes, it's in the people. And there are certain aspects of that character that you can pull out and you can put a label on. Right? And these are things like propriety, discipline, manners, respect, all of these sorts of things.
There are virtues and vices.
Yeah, sure, these are quintessentially English, because I think, the English, you're right, certainly have vices as well, as all people do.
Yes, yeah.
But the idea that you can take these values, abstract them, put them into a formula, into something that could be taught off of a PowerPoint, right? The idea that that's what it means to be British is a failed project. And actually, the entire kind of post-Enlightenment project in Europe has been to attempt to crystallize national identities into these
in those
packages.
terms,
ideologies basically, and then export them to other places. You were just saying about the wars in the Middle East over the last 30 years being the attempt of the American empire to export their ideology to those foreign lands. The idea that Afghanistan wants liberal democracy, which is just absurd. But equally absurd is the idea that you can bring anyone to Britain, and if they just take the package off the shelf and plug it into themselves, they become British.
Let's go there, because that's it's not on my sort of plan for the interview, but let's go there, because I got Gareth Jones over, the guy that wrote Culture, Transplant, which I think, if you want to understand, because immigration identity is such a key issue in all these Western societies, and it's such a crisis for us, I think that is the one book I would say, read that book, Gareth Jones, The Culture, Transplant. And of course, it's a brilliant book, and what he demonstrates in data is that cultural attitudes, traits, if you like, of particular groups, populations, are extremely permanent. They're extremely resilient across the generations. You can get Italian Americans on cultural matters generally. If you survey them in America, even fourth generation, fifth generation Italian, pretty much think what Italians think, particularly if they're not married out. So it's a preposterous idea. And also, I think the other thing we've got to be honest about is the idea. It's an unreasonable idea to take a very large population of, say, people from the Middle East or people from Asian subcontinent and say, come to Britain, and then, by the way, shed everything that you are, just get rid of it and become whatever the approximation of British value. No, they don't want to do that. They're not going to do it. There's no evidence that they will do it. So I think the second chapter in the book is the assimilation myth. So, I mean, that's correct, isn't it?
But it shows you the attitude of our leaders, that they think culture is so superficial that you can just take it on and off like a costume.
But they're wrong.
They are. Of course they're wrong. Because culture is, the only thing really that mankind has in common is our need for food, water, and shelter and air, right? Beyond that, we're actually very different, all of the various tribes of the earth. And the idea that that's some superficial thing that you can just shed at a moment's notice is nonsense, but it tells you how our leaders look at human beings, right? And I think that this is a liberal attitude, it's a capitalist attitude. The idea that human beings are just interchangeable economic units, and that culture is just a coat of paint that you can strip away and paint and all this sort of thing. No, that's not what human beings are. Human beings are, first and foremost, tribal creatures. We're not individuals, as liberalism would have us believe.
But they not only is the prospect that everyone just sheds their values and gets into whatever values you're trying to give them, that's preposterous, but also the potential dangers in creating very, very different. The reality of balkanization, ethnic conflict, which is a hardy perennial, unfortunately, in multiracial societies. None of this matters. It's all hello birds, hello sky. It'll all be fine. So I think they're wrong about everything. Yeah. I mean, that's a...
And just on the point you made, I agree. Like, it's actually quite a weird type of person that is able to leave their homeland, go somewhere else, and completely shed away their
We've never done
culture.
it.
Yeah.
You go to Australia. I have family in Australia. You go to Australia, it's pretty Anglo civilization.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Let's talk about deracination, because I think this is a word you've mentioned a few times. So one of the issues, I mean, all the things we're talking about, place and rootedness and duty and love of a pint of Adnams and a village cricket, and I think England in the summer particularly deals up just to bliss.
Yes.
I mean, it's just absolutely phenomenal, quite unlike anywhere else. But the modern life is, because a lot of our problems, right, Charlie, I think are just modern life. People, we're angry with ridiculous, liberal nostrums and woke idiots and things, fine, okay. But a lot of it is just modernity. A lot of it's just what's happened.
Yes.
And so what's happened is that the structure that we have is dependent on dispersal. If you're from a poor northern town, to get on is to get out, and you're educated that way. But even if you're not, if you're from Kent, can you stay in Kent? No, graduate jobs are in London or Manchester, and you're away to university, and you have these achieved identities. So would you agree that a lot of the things we sort of hanker after and want are going to be very difficult to get just because of modernity, because people are uprooted and transported and dropped elsewhere, and it's very harmful to some of the things we want, isn't it? But how do you get...
So Thomas Carlyle is a real influence on me, a real major influence on me in the way that I think and view the world. I think he was a prophetic writer. He saw coming he saw all of this coming. Right? He was writing during the Victorian period, and he watched as the dual forces of liberalism and mechanization were sweeping across the land and uprooting these settled communities and creating what he called nomadism, which he decried. He said that this was a terrible thing for ordinary people to constantly be on the move in pursuit of work or accommodation or whatever else. Because actually, in order to feel that crucial sense of belonging and purpose and community, you actually need to be somewhere where you feel rooted, where you feel
stay
you
there
stake
and build your life there.
Yeah. Because he was writing at a time where what would become the corporation was coming into existence, right? And where
well, it's the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. And as I said, increasingly the worker was viewed not as a kind of a noble cog in the wider community, an irreplaceable, non-fungible, element of the community, but increasingly as a fungible good. The worker is something that you can move.
But it's
around
worse than that, Charlie. The history of it is worse than that. So if you look at, say, we're encouraged to think about transatlantic slavery a lot, and it was a wicked and period in history. But the fact for British people in the Midlands and the North particularly is that some of the practices that were going on in the West Indies were imported into mills in the Midlands and to Leeds and Bradford and Manchester. And kids of 10 and 12 were treated like slaves, effectively. And and I think there's I don't know if you call it a race memory or a sort of a causal sort of chain of distress, but I think the whole of that was discombobulating on society.
Yeah, but this is the thing. I mean, as I said, Carlyle wrote about nomadism, and he decried it as a bad thing. But today, the culture at large champions nomadism. It champions a lifestyle where you are constantly on the move and never tied down. Yeah, this kind of idea that goes around, the idea that things like marriage and family, and child rearing, and all of these sorts of things are somehow inhibiting your freedom, your rights to absolute individual autonomy. These things, like it's no wonder that the age of marriage is so high now. It's about 35 in Britain, because so many people want to, quote, live their life before they get married. Yeah, but what does that even mean? What does it mean to live your life?
I know, but then that. I know. Well, certainly, I mean, you speak to any parent. The most meaningful thing that we've done is to have children. Yeah. So nothing else compares to that. And love is a far more powerful force than any other force in the universe. But
this is the thing again. Like, we've been taught to believe that the substance of life is to be found in that kind of pursuit of individual self-expression. When actually it isn't. When actually the substance of life, as our ancestors knew, is to be found in things like family, community, nation, faith. All of these things, these sources of identity and belonging that have been, systematically deconstructed over the last 50 or so years by the academy, by the media, and eventually by the government.
I'm going to say you're a social democrat. All right.
Maybe.
There you go. No, that's perfectly right. Do you read Patrick Deneen? Have you read his
I'm familiar.
So he's a Catholic American thinker. He wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed. And it's exactly about this. He said, if you go back 200 years ago, how would someone describe themselves? They might say, I'm a Northumbrian, I'm a Newcastle United fan, I'm a Catholic, I live in this village. I mean, most of the ways they describe themselves would be about other people or institutions, relational things that they were part of that make them. Now, it's I'm this, and it's all achieved identities. And I think it's made people very sad, because I think the root, it's not Carlyle, another American thinker was right when he said that, sorry, not another American, but an American thinker said, basically, your route to happiness is concern for others, and I think that's right. Thomas Paine.
But this idea of deracination, I think, is so important for modernity, like you said, because I think the questions that so many young people have, that they are not getting answered by, the institutions, for example, it lies in the fact that belonging is not to be found in, these kind of hedonistic pursuits. And actually, on the other side of those hedonistic pursuits is depression. And emptiness and meaninglessness. Well, actually, it's place that gives you...
I totally agree. I mean, we're going to have to stop agreeing. Before we get onto that, because I want to talk about Gen Z and the mental health issues that we're experiencing. But I want to just quickly, before I do, talk about intergenerational fairness, because the way it's set up, young people are set up as in opposition somehow to elder people, and boomers get a bad rap. Some of that might be justified, might not be. But it sets it up in opposition without realising that that boomers, of course, have children and grandchildren, and it's certainly in their own lives and their own families, they're sort of in it together. Do you think how do we scope our way through this conflict between generations? Because the boomers vote, right, and what your generation needs to start voting.
Yeah, that's actually a really tricky one, because I think it's an easy kind of win as a young person to say the boomers. They bought their properties super cheap, they've held on to them, and now they're super expensive, and they don't want to sell them. It's in their interest that the housing market remain really expensive. And the attitude that sometimes comes across where they say, well, if you spent less on avocado or taters at Starbucks, then maybe you could afford a house. And it's like, you just don't understand the situation that we are growing up in, right? And in terms of the social values, there is, again, a stereotype that the boomers squandered this inheritance that they had in the 60s and so on, where, the kind of, the liberalism, the sexual revolution.
They are the liberalism.
And the sort of the drug-taking culture and all that sort of thing really came into existence. The idea that we are somehow at fault for, the condition of the country now, I think is pretty laughable. But with that being said, I also think that it's not good to sort of foster and harbour resentment for for any person on the basis of their generational identity.
I agree with you.
Especially because, these are, as much as we might disagree with some of the choices that they made as a generation, like these are our elders, and we should respect them for that reason alone. And I think that conflict between generations, it takes focus away from the actual important things, the actual important conflicts.
It also stops a better thing, which in my opinion would be better, is persuasion, because I think, as a party we're against the triple lock. It's an absurd thing. I mean, you can't privilege. No, it's ludicrous. Yes, no, it's ludicrous. It's crude. It's a crude political measure, but it's also really bad public policy. I mean, this party, we want a strong, united Britain, and we want one based on secure families and productive industries. But good governance is like, people think it's boring. And if you tweet about it, people say, gloss over. You're talking about the SCP's talking about good governance again. Yeah. But good governance is not promising and writing away billions of pounds that you don't even know you have. It's totally irrational. But if that's going to be changed, I think it's more persuasion. I think it's more your generation saying, give us a break.
But the idea that we are somehow the entitled ones, like the young people that are somehow the entitled ones, when the elder generations consistently vote along lines of self-interest.
Totally.
Okay, this party is going to give me money. The Conservative Party, right? Yeah. This party is going to give me money because of my age. It's no different to the voting blocks that Labour try to kind of appeal to by promising them money, and that ultimately, I mean, that's democracy at the end of the day.
Yeah, but maybe I'm old-fashioned. I think we're in it together. I think unless you realise that we're all part of the same society, and actually, a lot of older people would vote for policies that would directly assist young people, and a lot of people in our party argue for it. Right. A couple of final things. Now, a very interesting statement you made quite a few times. You say you're not a conservative. Now, part of that, you quite rightly, I think, draw attention to the incoherence of libertarian free tradism and deindustrialization and the damage it's done, and you've been critical of Thatcherism in denigrating institutions that are key to how society works. So I think all that's right. But if you're not a conservative, what are you? I mean, how would you define your political philosophy? Do you have one that would be describable in that way?
So my problem with the term conservative is that it's entirely relative, right? It's entirely based on the current conditions, because ultimately, there's a great body of conservative philosophy, people like Oakeshott, Scruton, Burke, etc. And that's all good stuff. I've read all that stuff, great. But actually, when the rubber hits the road, the conservative tends to just want to preserve things as they are now, right? Your average conservative just wants to maintain the status quo.
Minimise change.
And I think that in the moment that we are living through right now, that's the worst possible thing you could do. And so I am a radical. I'm not a conservative, politically speaking, because I believe in radical change. Because as much as I've said before, I'm perhaps conservative in the Oakeshottian sense, in that I prefer the near to the far, the tried to the untried, and all the rest of it. But actually, politically, I think we are in desperate need of radical change at almost every level.
By the way, it's a job for Ollie, actually. That Oakeshott quote is a wonderful, wonderful quote.
Yes.
And we should put it up in the interview.
But that essay on being conservative, there's parts of that I agree with, but there's parts of that where the temperament that Oakeshott lays out is actually the temperament of quite a weak person, right? Because the conservative...
It has a timidity to it.
Yeah, the conservative doesn't have the strength of character to actually stand up and enforce what he believes in. There's a fear, there's a timidity, there's a caution there that for the moment we're living through right now is totally inappropriate. What we need is people who actually believe in something and who are prepared to die for those beliefs. And that's why I call myself a radical. And you can't, radical conservative is kind of a contradiction.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm certainly, that doesn't make me a leftist, right? I'm not a liberal. I'm not a socialist or any of these sorts of things. But I'm not a conservative either.
But the term, I mean, having internal contradictions has not stopped a whole generation of Tories since Thatcher have called themselves conservative and conserve nothing.
Yes, exactly. And that's the other thing, by the way, is I don't know if, like communism, I don't know if real conservatism has ever actually been achieved. Because can you name a time in history where conservatives have conserved anything of meaning?
I think there are, actually, strangely enough, there are some examples, particularly in Europe, of administrations that were ultra-conservative, social conservative and economically prudent and so on. Salazar's Stadinova in Portugal was a very conservative Catholic administration, but funnily enough, that administration still didn't. I mean, they had the gold standard, and they didn't spend more than and it was faith, flag, and family, and very socially conservative. But it didn't stop modernity, and it didn't stop a revolution. So it didn't actually.
And this is the problem with conservatism. I think that a lot of conservatives think that everyone is going to be playing by the same rules politically. Ultimately, they think that it's quite an English thing. Actually, they assume everyone's going to be.
Is it an innocence?
Yeah, there is, and I think that again, for the time we're living through, that's totally inappropriate. And so, what I basically believe, I'm not such a fan of political labels because I think, like so many things, people can read their own meaning into them. And so that's why I just call myself a radical. I want to see systemic change in Britain, and the vision of this country that I have is one where there is a marriage of the old and the new, because I think both have value. Because the old, in the structures of society, is where mankind has always found meaning and belonging. So things like family, community, a sense of nationhood, and faith are crucial things to human well-being, right? Because it's out of those things that you derive meaning, purpose, belonging, and identity, right?
That's a great.
But at the same time, a Britain governed by, the kind of ideas that I have, you'd still have people driving around in cars and using computers and all the rest of it. Because I'm not like a Luddite. I do think technology is a wonderful thing if it's in the right hands, as all things actually. A country governed along traditional. I mean, I'm a Catholic, so I would advocate for a Catholic morality, which I view as being objectively correct. A society governed along those lines, technology is not going to be a problem because it's ensconced within this larger moral framework that will make certain behaviours and certain kind of, certain behaviours just off limits, right?
Yeah, it's not. It's a lovely segue into that. I mean, I think you're quite right that you get away with you dispense with your inheritance, your cultural inheritance, the things that link you to your past, and the biggest one of all is the loss of faith. I mean, the collapse in your principal belief system. I mean, I think it's a primary cause of the cultural malaise. It's the primary cause of loss. It's very difficult to, and it goes way back. I mean, it's Darwinism and it's post First World War crisis. So but it's a major problem. And I mean, I don't want to major the interview on immigration. We've all talked a lot about immigration, but the one thing you shouldn't do if you're in a period of shedding your principal belief system and the collapse in Christianity is import millions of people that don't share any doubts about their belief system.
And who are actively hostile to others.
Yeah, it can be. So, but that's a nice segue into the final penultimate thing I want to talk to you about, which is Gen Z's mental health crisis. And it is a crisis. On the data, it's a crisis. A lot of people, young people, have with very, very high rates of anxiety, loneliness, anomie.
Half say that they feel anxious all the time.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously we've just segued into it with the collapse in Christianity, but what's the cause of this, Charlie?
Well, it comes back to this rootlessness that we've kind of touched on a few times as we've been speaking. Because if you're not anchored in reality, if you're not anchored in something real and something concrete, like an objective idea of what morality is, the idea that there is, just as much as there are immutable principles that govern the physical world, which we call the laws of physics, there are also immutable laws that govern the metaphysical world and govern things like morality and beauty and truth. If you don't have that concrete grounding in metaphysical reality, then you are just adrift, right? And if you are adrift, then it's no wonder that people start to feel lost mentally and spiritually. Yeah. And it's therefore no surprise that inevitably collapses into depression and anxiety. And I think, there's a number of other factors at play here, like social media. That's another big one.
Well, let's just dive right into that, because I didn't get into trouble. I tended to say what I think is right and not worry too much. I'm not really worried too much. Yeah, but about a year and a half ago, we set a little group up, and it became quite a big group of people that were concerned about the effects of smartphones and social media on young people and children, really. And I think, I made a statement, it's now not particularly controversial, I think, but I think smartphones or active access to unfettered internet access for the under 16s should be banned. I think it's so harmful and even possibly civilizationally dangerous. So what's your take on that? I mean, people are totally addicted, aren't they? It's a major, major problem.
I know I am.
Yeah.
I mean, it is an interesting one, right? Because I am open to the idea. But at the same time, like I said, I'm a big believer in technology. I think that technology can be used to create immense good. It can be used to create immense wealth and well-being for people. And I think that the technological revolution that we are staring down the barrel of now with AI and all these sorts of things has the capacity to save huge amounts of money, generate huge amounts of money, and lead to a better quality of life for all people if it's in the right hands, right? When it comes to smartphones and children having them and social media.
We're talking about 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds getting addicted to these things.
Well, this is the thing. I am a child of the internet in many ways, right? So as I said, I was a teenager through the 2010s. And my parents were very strict when it came to internet access. But even then, I was a big gamer, right? So I grew up
hours and hours.
But
that's what they say. So that's what Jonathan Haidt would say in the research in the books. Would say, look, the lads are gaming and they're competing on the game, and there's a sort of chat about that. But with younger girls, it's hierarchical, and that's when it can lead to bullying. And
that's really important, I think, because I grew up playing like Minecraft and Call of Duty with my friends, and watching YouTube and surfing the net and all the rest of it. And I wouldn't have had it any other way, actually, because it really shaped to a large extent who I am today. Because I think that it gave me unprecedented access to knowledge and to ideas and to personalities, figures to look up to and all this sort of thing. And that's all great stuff. And I think I was quite lucky because my parents were very strict with my internet access.
But there you go, that's what you said, you see that?
Yeah.
And the problem that for the public...
But there's a balance, because I think just banning outright is possibly... I don't know if it's just taking a hammer to the issue where you don't actually necessarily need to. But in the case of young girls, which obviously you just raised, I think this is crucial because, I know plenty of girls. I've had female friends my whole life. And the effect that the internet has had on them has been very different to the effect that it has on young boys.
That's what the research says,
And I don't have any figures to hand. I'm just speaking from personal experience, speaking from my lived experience, in keeping with my generation.
Well, your lived experience is truth for everyone, right?
Well, exactly. That's another thing I think that people need to get to grips with, is the idea that the left and the woke don't need to have a monopoly on lived experience, because it's actually very useful and it's true, right? And my lived experience of the female friends in my life who have become addicted to social media is it has always left them a total mess emotionally, right? So I think there's definitely a conversation to be had there. I think restricting social media and smartphone access is a good idea insofar as it will encourage them to do other things. It will encourage young people to spend their time
more productive things.
Outdoors or socializing in person, which are all important things, again, for that sense of belonging and place and rootedness and all that sort of thing. Because, the internet is a great thing, but it's also just, it's like being in space, right? You're just kind of going from one thing to the other and they're not really physically connected.
My point is that there is a lack of caution. People talk about the mass immigration experiment. How will it work out for the West? Well, it is an experiment. It's unprecedented, and it may not work out very well. Unfettered, constant internet access for children is an experiment. I don't think it's going to turn out very well. And it's a collective action problem, because I think if you say, well, it's up to parents, well, I can tell you the parent will not be able to do it in many cases. And if you are the parent that says, my son or daughter is not going to have it, you're socially ostracized, and it's extremely difficult, which is why we can be quite statey in the SDP and say, I'm sorry, but this is a collective action problem. It's going to be banned. I mean, I'm all in favour of banning it in schools, but I would try and ban smartphones for under 16s across the board.
Well, again, I'm pretty open.
That is quite radical.
To that. And I've got to tell you, in my own childhood, I was able to outmaneuver my parents quite easily.
Easily,
right?
Yes.
Because you're a young person, and this is all natural to you, where it's maybe not natural to them. It'll be interesting to see how, as my generation become parents, how we will approach this issue. Because a lot of my friends, again, who are not particularly political or conservative, they're all saying, no way my kid's going to have social media or a smartphone.
No, you've got to go be ahead of the curve on it. You were in a way relying on
which is an interesting broad preference, right? It's interesting that's increasingly the case. Maybe the state action won't be necessary, but I agree, perhaps it is.
Maybe, but you've got to. It just is not on the evidence. Is not going to. Every parent is not going to be able to do it, and some parents, will use it as a crutch and so on. So it's the way it is. So I'm in favour of a fairly firm approach. We can be quite authoritarian authoritarian at times. So finally, we always try and end up on solutions. So how are we going to get out of this mess? I as leading a political party, looking for political solutions, building people, drawing people in that agree with us, and actually winning elections and getting elected reps and so on. In your generation, there is more than a hint of dissatisfaction with democracy.
Yes.
Because democracy has led us here. But are you on our side in as much that, democracy and vote them out has to be a solution, right? Doesn't it?
Well, I think if you're not proposing a political solution, inevitably you're proposing basically a violent one. Like, that's basically the dichotomy. And I am, as an Englishman, not in favour of violent revolution. I think it would be disastrous, and I think the volatility that it would bring in is couldn't be more undesirable, right? So I do think that political solutions have to be our first course. With that being said, I mean, so I studied elite theory, Italian elite theory, when I was at university. And that really informs my perspective on democracy, which is basically that democracy is a political formula, right? It's a top-line justification for the presence of the current elites, as elites, right? Because they were voted in, or they are representing the will of the people. Because they got X many votes at the last election and all the rest of it. Now, sure, that works for the public-facing elected element of government that we see in the Commons, 650 people. Does it work for the 500,000 who work in the civil service, who are not elected, whose names we don't know, whose salaries we pay?
Well, they're in charge.
Yeah.
They're in charge.
And so I think that my perspective really is that I just want a political system that serves the interests of ordinary people, that is in the corner of ordinary people, ordinary British people, that's going to look out for people, and that's going to make life not as easy as possible, but it's going to make life. It's not going to put up unnecessary barriers. It's not going to excessively tax people. And it's not going to tell people what to think and what they're allowed to say and what they're not allowed to say.
Shouldn't do that at all. Yeah.
And so, if democracy can get us there, fine. But actually, if another system can get us there, I'm fine with that as well. I think that democracy as we have it in this country, the kind of person that it selects for is not a particularly high caliber person. It's somebody. Ultimately, the kind of democracy we have, it selects for people who can win elections inevitably, right? And who's the type of person who can win an election? Well, it's somebody who is going to tell the crowd what the crowd wants to hear. Is going to promise the crowd all sorts of wonderful things, and is going to take money from people, who makes running for election possible, because it's not cheap to run for election, right? And so you need backers, you need donors, and if you compromise yourself by taking their money, then you will probably say things that you don't necessarily believe. And that's the kind of person that our democracy selects for. Now, I do think that there are, of course, exceptions to that rule, but I also think that the change that we need it's deeper than just politics. Politics is a very important part of it, and I do think democracy can be a vehicle to achieve that change, but it's far more profound. Because just on that previous topic we were talking about the smartphones and so on, it's never been more important to have a concrete grounding in morality and truth than it is now. Because you can weather the storms of modernity, you can navigate the rough waters of modernity if you have that rooting in truth and reality, right? And politics is no different. What is needed is a political force, a vehicle that stands for truth and stands for morality and stands for beauty and all of these things that we don't ever hear mentioned in the halls of power today. And to actually get to specifics, I'll tell you what I think the solution is. I have a huge amount of respect for the SDP, by the way. As you've said, I mean, I align with you on pretty much everything. With that being said, your footprint is quite small on the political landscape. I think that you are effective as a kind of an engine for ideas and policies. I mean, I've read some of your policies. I mean, in this, for example.
Well, a lot of people have stolen it.
But maybe that's your best function. As being a kind of somewhere between a think tank and a party. But anyway, putting that to one side, I think the landscape as it stands right now is very, very demoralising. Right? It's a bleak thing to look out across because you have Labour in government, and they are, again, almost exclusively made up of people who don't care about the interests of ordinary people, are kind of puritanical and ideological.
Don't like the country.
Yeah, don't like the country. And they're actually true believers in their own nonsense.
And very wrong.
Right? And totally incorrect about so many different things, from economics to national identity into truth, everything, right? So that's the government. And then in opposition, you have the kind of regime parties like the Lib Dems who don't really disagree with people in the civil service on anything. Same with with the Greens.
Yeah.
And then you have the right. Right? You have the Conservative Party and you have Reform. The Conservative Party, the current leadership of the party, do not know what time it is in the slightest. They are absolutely out of touch. Embodied in the figure of Kemi Badenoch. I think she's a deeply unimpressive person, and I can't wait for her flatlining non-leadership to end, because it's just been a total embarrassment, and I don't know what the hell the Tory membership were thinking electing her as leader. I think they really did just like that. It was like it's a blasphemy,
something new,
saying our words, and they enjoyed that for whatever reason. Within the Conservative Party, however, you do have this faction of people who are increasingly kind of powerful, led by Robert Jenrick, who I've met and spoke with a number of times, and who, I don't know whether his conversion from kind of Cameronite liberal to hardline anti-immigration activist is authentic. And to be honest with you, I'm actually not all that concerned, because the fact that he's prepared to say the things that he does both in public and in private tells me that he knows what time it is. And and there's a little faction. Sorry, go on.
I mean, history says actually they recover.
Yeah.
The two-party system is set up to destroy challengers. And in the 80s, it was this party.
Yes.
Challenger.
Yes.
And actually, we polled much bigger polling than Reform get now. We're up to 52%.
Yeah.
And it still didn't break the mold. But
And
I
so
agree with you. You need
yeah.
to break these. In particular, you need to break the selection, the stranglehold on the system that the selection processes that two major parties have.
Yes.
Because basically, we're governed by people that are the same. They think the same things, educated in the same ways. And so, I totally agree. An insurgency to that is absolutely vital.
So this faction in the Conservative Party, it's people like Robert Jenrick, Katie Lamb, Neil O'Brien, Nick Timothy, various others, who are thinking seriously about the problems that we're facing, right? And again, but actually, if they're prepared to have these conversations...
Well, Nick Timothy says a lot of things that we agree with.
Well, they all do, and I respect and like all of them. But, given the track record of the Conservative Party, I'm not immediately inclined to totally just get on board.
They've got bigger problems because whatever they say, people don't believe, and that's because of the legacy.
And they've got to make back that ground. Okay? But nevertheless, I see sparks of hope in that little faction. Then you have Reform, whose orbit I've been in for a number of years, and I'm increasingly concerned about Reform, to be honest, because I think right now they are the most viable vehicle for radical change in this country. But I think until they're prepared to put in the hard yards when it comes to research and policy and all these sorts of things, instead of just glitz and glamour, is that a government in waiting? I'm not sure it is.
It's a wrecking ball. But it hasn't. And also they haven't really resolved. They've pinched our slogan. They've pinched quite a few policy ideas. But there's usually very little depth behind it. When they're asked about it, they slightly flounder, and there is an inbuilt incoherence, because most of the leadership are still at heart and hearts they're sort of economic liberal Thatcherites, but they're trying to win votes from somewhere else. So they're saying things that they're new to them, and if I'm very charitable, maybe they have had a Damaseekers version. I'm not really sure, but we'll have to watch and wait. But they might be useful to the country in terms of breaking the system. Just to finish, I think you're. It's lovely to speak to you, by the way.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
It's been a long time in coming, and I agree with you totally. I think you need political institutions. You need to be able to win elections to clear out some of this mess, and to do some basic things like build some nuclear power stations, build some houses, get the transport working, so on, get decent trade policies. Agree with all of that, but I also totally agree with you that it's a cultural restoration that you need in politics and right through society. If you don't get that, nothing will improve. So let's hope we can do it.
And I've got to say, I mean, there is an emerging, still a minority, but an emerging contingent of young people who are thinking in this way very seriously, right? Because we don't want liberalism.
No.
We look at the offerings of liberalism, the hedonism, the self-gratification, the worship of the self that lies at the core of liberalism, and we're not interested in that.
It's empty, totally empty.
It's meaningless, and actually, real meaning is to be found in those things. But I've said about already that our ancestors knew, which is family, community, nation, and faith. I think any party that is championing those things and really championing them, not just saying them, but actually embodying them,
we believe
lives,
it's belief. Actually,
then that's the way forward.
Great. Good to chat. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.